If a tree falls at a men's rights conference, does any feminist hear it? Not if we judge by two recent articles about London's International Conference on Men's Issues, in which we find all the standard smear tactics: discredit, defame, demean, distort, deflect, and deny. And that's my subject on today's Flamingo File. I'm Janice Flamingo of the University of Ottawa. In the second to last weekend in July, my husband and I attended the ICMI organized by Mike Buchanan and Paul Elam and held in London, England. It involved a blockbuster lineup of presenters. And all of the presentations will soon be online, so I invite you to watch them yourself. These include researchers who have spent years documenting the disadvantages men face socially, legally, medically, and in education, such as male suicide, depression, their decline in educational attainment, vastly disproportionate incarceration rates, false accusations, denial of the right to parent their children, and increasing social stigma all across the culture. And there were advocates who have poured enormous energy and ingenuity into opposing the feminist slander that men's main problem today is a sense of entitlement. And there were individuals who told personal stories of suffering at the hands of malevolent women in a culture so focused on protecting women and girls, it can hardly believe in men's pain at all. Even though nothing I heard at the conference was really surprising, still at times I felt an intense wave of pity and rage. But rage, or even just ordinary anger at injustice, is one of the things that you're never allowed to feel, or at least never to express, as a men's issues advocate, according to Lara Whyte and Robert Jackman. These are two feminist reporters, Lara Whyte, writing for an online publication called 50/50, and Robert Jackman for Vice magazine. Not surprisingly, their sneering disdain doesn't seem to have been even slightly dented by the conference. Though they sat through at least some of the same presentations I did, you wouldn't know that from their predictable dismissals, in which both argue essentially that whatever legitimate substance there might be behind the men's rights movement, and both writers do acknowledge some substance, the movement can be disregarded. Actually, more than that, the movement should be actively opposed because some men's rights advocates are angry. According to Lara Whyte, conference goers, quote, fury and frustration were, quote, palpable and, quote, at times distressing. In other words, we're a lot of scary weirdos worthy only of scorn. Both writers are quick to invoke the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate list. Whyte tells us, for example, that Paul Elam is considered a purveyor of, quote, male supremacy by the SPLC, and that he once wrote a satire about domestic violence that declared October, quote, bash a violent bitch month. In other words, he noted that the vast majority of domestic violence is two-way, both men and women involved. And he argued that it's unfair to blame men who hit back at violent women. A contention, by the way, that I support 100%, so put me on the list too, please. Jackman tells us, on the other hand, that in early 2018, the SPLC officially, not just unofficially, classed two men's rights organizations as hate groups, and that it condemns the majority for their, quote, misogynistic tone. It's well known that the SPLC applies the hate label to any organization or person, no matter how committed to peaceful and fact-based advocacy whose politics don't correspond to their far-left platform. Notably, the SPLC does not list Antifa or ISIS as hate groups, but that doesn't diminish the enormous respect with which Whyte and Jackman quote their pronouncements. In fact, with SPLC backing, it seems the two writers never feel compelled to show how anything said by anybody at the conference was actually misogynistic. And of course, they couldn't have found a single thing. The bogeyman of the alt-right is also trotted out by both writers, in what is perhaps the most ludicrous statement in an article filled with misrepresentations. Lara Whyte claims that at one point, in a breakout room prior to Karen Straughan's keynote address, she, Lara, was, quote, briefly the only woman in a room of entirely white men, end quote. There you go. My God, the horror of it. It was only briefly, mind you, because there were numerous women and non-white men at the conference, both as speakers and attendees, but it must have been a pretty scary experience, even for that split second, especially since the men were, quote, entirely white. Misplaced modifier there, and lots of implications of racial purity. This brave woman had to endure a great deal to report on the dark, that is, white underbelly of men's rights. Both writers also triumphantly seize on the fact that one of the presenters, Oliver Hoffmann, founder of an Austrian men's rights political party, advocated coalition building with a wide range of groups, including white nationalists. And I would encourage anyone who is concerned about this claim to watch Hoffmann's presentation, which I think will soon be online, and judge for yourself. His point was pretty clearly, in my opinion, that if men's rights is to have any traction at the political level, it should consider partnering with other anti-feminist and anti-SJW groups in order to advocate for the core values of Western civilization, which he defined as individual rights and freedoms, rule of law, and equality before the law. Hardly neo-Nazi themes. And yes, some of the conference attendees, especially those from Western Europe that have seen the societal devastation that is resulting from mass Muslim immigration, have concerns about multiculturalism and open borders. That doesn't equate to white supremacism by a long shot, but Whyte and Jackman want you to believe it does. Neither of these writers makes any attempt to hide their mocking distaste for everything associated with a men's issues conference. Lara Whyte, for example, tells us, as if exposing the bizarre superstition of a UFO crank, that organizer Mike Buchanan was reluctant to provide her with a journalist pass or even to tell her the conference location. And this strikes her as giggle-worthy. She says, quote, I spent considerable time trying to convince Buchanan I was not the feminist my previously published work might make me seem, end quote. In other words, she lied about having a genuine interest in men's issues. And she tells us with evident amusement, and a dangling modifier, by the way, that, quote, burrowed in the far reaches of London's XL Centre, security at the meeting was tight, end quote. Yeah, that's right, Lara. The location was secret, and there had to be security because the people on your side of the ideological divide regularly shut down attempts to discuss men's issues, either by complaining to the venue about men's rights hate and thus forcing the event's cancellation, as has happened countless times with the Red Pill movie, which you falsely claim was banned from cinemas in Australia. It wasn't banned, it was simply shut down by irate feminists. Or they show up en masse and prevent people from going into the venue, something I've witnessed over and over again. So men's rights advocates are compelled to take precautionary measures that feminist speakers, no matter how radical, would almost never have to take. And you wonder why some of the men at these conferences are a little angry. Robert Jackman is even more upfront with his flippancy. He tells us from the beginning that he wanted to attend ICMI, quote, to see whether the attendees really all were the women-hating wackos they are believed to be. His answer is, yes, we pretty much all are, perhaps with the exception of feminist-trained Professor Eric Anderson and one or two others. In order to reinforce his contention about the wackiness of those who attended The conference, Jackman often mentions specific men's issues with a disdainful rhetorical shrug, inviting us all to chuckle along with him at MRA's lunatic concerns. For example, he calls circumcision a, quote, huge hang-up for the movement, end quote. And he says that MRA's advocacy of paternity testing is evidence of how the movement is, quote, obsessed with cuckolding, end quote. Well, Jackman, maybe you don't give a damn whether the boy you raise is your own son or not, or whether circumcision has serious health and human rights implications, but your mockery proves little but your own lack of seriousness. Jackman even goes so far as to fabricate evidence of misogyny. At one point, he informs readers that, quote, the language used at the conference can be dehumanizing, whether deliberate or accidental. Men in general are, quote, men, whereas women are usually females, end quote. Balderdash! I happen to have an English prof's aversion to the use of the adjective female as a noun, so I would have noticed if it had been used that way, and it wasn't. But even if it had, it doesn't indicate misogyny. It's used because there is no noun in English that refers to both women and girls. If that's the best example Jackman could find of attendees' supposed dehumanization of women, it's no wonder he had to fall back on the libels of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, where it isn't possible simply to demean through mockery or reference to made-up language crimes, the writers resort to more blatant distortions, sometimes focusing on individual presentations, sometimes generalizing about the movement as a whole. Lara Whyte, for example, tells us that Karen Strawn's keynote presentation, get this, was, quote, a peculiar mix of personal anecdotes, riffs on female privilege and gynocentrism, and the odd scattering of decontextualized fact, end quote. For anyone who's ever heard the master of cogent rhetoric, Karen Strawn, speak anywhere, at any time, this is a bizarre allegation. What did Whyte find so peculiar or odd about Karen Strawn's talk? She doesn't explain. Jackman is similarly snooty without specifics about individual talks. He tells us, for example, that philosophy PhD Jeffrey Ketlin's presentation was, quote, rambling. Well, watch it for yourself and decide. I didn't think it was. And he refers derisively to a, quote, weird spider diagram in Ketlin's presentation, naming individual feminists and detailing how they had wronged him, end quote. What was so weird about it? Ketlin is a professor of axiomatic logic who was hounded out of his position at Oxford University by a feminist mob, claiming without evidence that he was responsible for the death by suicide of a mentally ill woman who had stalked him and his family for years. It didn't seem to me particularly weird that he chose to name those who ruined his career. Another blatant distortion is Jackman's claim that, quote, MRAs commonly have a victim mentality, viewing themselves as being systemically persecuted, with women getting a better deal, end quote. Now that is pure projection. It's not a victim mentality. If you really are systemically persecuted and disadvantaged, as a significant number of the presenters showed men to be, anyone who doubts the substance behind men's claims of discrimination should take a good, long look at William Collins' magisterial summation of the evidence available in video and on his magnificent blog, The Illustrated Empathy Gap. Find me anything there that is, quote, cherry-picked, as Lara Whyte had the gall to claim of the, quote, research and statistics she heard at the conference. A person with a victim mentality is someone, usually a woman, who takes pleasure in and derives her identity and power from a fantasy of victimhood, a fantasy that others believe and for which she is rewarded with state-enforced accommodations and lots of public concern. The term doesn't apply to men's rights activists, not least because there are no advantages to men in claiming discrimination in a society that either doesn't believe them, doesn't care, or finds vulnerable men repulsive. Lara Whyte gives Jackman a run for his money in the category of feminist distortion when she informs us that she detected amongst conference goers, quote, what appeared to be a shared mourning for an idealized past, end quote. Well, this couldn't possibly be supported even with creative interpretation by anything said at the conference. And Lara, if you'd done even a tiny bit of homework, you'd have known that the vast majority of MRAs not only reject feminist gynocentrism, but also traditional gynocentrism. MRAs don't long for a past in which men were expected to be the stoic, self-sacrificing providers, working themselves into an early grave in order to support the children they rarely saw, and the wife who complained that they were never home, but sure wasn't interested in having the money dry up. Lara, your statement tells us far more about your own echo chamber assumptions than it does about anyone who spoke at ICMI. Well, I've probably said enough to indicate the mindset of Whyte and Jackman, and there's plenty more that I won't bother with. What is perhaps most striking in both their articles is the near complete absence of argument, if by argument one means logical, fact-based rebuttal of any MRA claims. At one point, Lara Whyte quotes Paul Elam as saying that, quote, almost all the sacrifice of blood and sweat and of life that is required to keep the world turning is male sacrifice. Women won't do it. Women can't do it, end quote. You can almost hear Whyte's teeth grinding in aggravation, but she fails to offer even a quip in comeback, let alone a single example to show that Paul isn't right about that. Did you even listen to his talk, Lara? But hey, who needs to listen and argue when your only real thesis is that angry white men and their few female and non-white male allies are kooky creeps who don't deserve a hearing? You can even admit that those men have some legitimate issues to be angry about and ignore them anyway. Whyte says superciliously that, quote, the list of MRA grievances is long, but like any extremist movement, there are a few uncomfortable truths spurning the fury, end quote. I think she meant spurring, not spurning. She mentions male suicide, male educational underachievement, MGM, and lack of provisions for male domestic violence victims. Actually, a pretty hefty list. But her strangely constructed sentence, it's some version of the old saying that if you have 10,000 monkeys working at 10,000 typewriters, sooner or later, one of them is going to write Macbeth. So sure, occasionally MRAs hit on a real grievance that even a feminist can't deny, but that shouldn't mean we stop laughing. Jackman is even more smug in his backhanded acknowledgement of the real issues of the movement. At one point in his article, he admits that listening to the presentation of a male domestic violence victim, quote, you started to think there might be some utility in a men's rights movement, at least one started from scratch, untainted by what it has now come to represent, end quote. A paragraph later, after mentioning once again the supposed bigotry of MRAs, he says, quote, it's attitudes like this which make the movement hard to take seriously and which will ultimately harm those it wants to protect, end quote. And that's his last sentence. As sanctimonious and preachy as could be. Thanks, Jackman, for your concern that male victims aren't getting the support or attention they deserve because a tainted movement is advocating for them. If you advocated for them, that would be a different thing, I guess, because you'd do it the right way. But you're not going to, are you? You're not going to start your own movement for men or focus on the things that are real in the MRM because you're a pro-feminist guy who'd rather spend your time scoffing at MRA wackos and being appalled by their misogynistic tone. Your concern for real male victims, it's so deep, it won't sully itself with any action whatsoever. And thus we come full circle to MRA anger and the smug, superior smirks of Lara Whyte and Robert Jackman.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.